What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. It is my pleasure to be joined today by Paul Carter. Paul, how you doing, my man?
Hey, what's up, Mike? Thanks for having me on, bud.
It's truly an honor. I'm super excited to get into our topics of discussion today. We are primarily going to be focused on training, particularly in regards to exercise selection as well as specificity in terms of training for hypertrophy. So, to give us a brief background of how specificity might apply to hypertrophy training, I think it's worthwhile to get into your background as a lifter. You have experience in both powerlifting and bodybuilding. I believe you were primarily a powerlifter first. Is that correct, Paul?
No, that's actually opposite. My first
Oh,
love,
really?
yeah, my first love, that was one of the things when I looked over your questions. I was like, well, we'll have to correct that. So when I started training, I started training in a bodybuilding type fashion. And that was my first love in training was basically bodybuilding and training to get bigger. And I transitioned over into powerlifting. It was probably 15, maybe even 20 years later, and then competed for almost a decade before happily retiring from that shit. So and then just went back to a lot of what I was doing. And in the last few years, I've worked a lot with the guys from N1 to become more proficient in the biomechanics of training purely for hypertrophy and stuff like that.
Very cool. Yeah, I recently had Kasim on the podcast. The guys from N1 are doing some absolutely fantastic stuff in regards to exercise selection and just the nuances of program design for hypertrophy. And I think you're also a brilliant mind when it comes to these topics, and you're putting out some great ideas that I think not enough people are paying attention to in some respects. They're not thinking critically about the exercise they're choosing and the muscles they're trying to target. So I think our discussion today is going to provide some very valuable insight. When we look at your history of powerlifting training, your bodybuilding training beforehand and transitioning, I'm curious about just the general differences in program design that you have found. Personally, I've dabbled in powerlifting, primarily focused on bodybuilding now, and I've noticed I'm just able to train much more frequently when it comes to bodybuilding. For powerlifting, I really couldn't muster up the energy for more than perhaps 4 times per week. There's just a psychological toll when it comes to the heavy weights and the low rep sets performed on a regular basis. Also, just due to the specificity of the sport, there's some connective tissue degradation that felt like was always getting in the way towards the tail end of training blocks. What were your experiences?
Pretty similar to what you just said. The difference was I had to do kind of I had to relearn training altogether when I went from bodybuilding into powerlifting. The two training styles aren't anything remotely alike, other than just using barbells and dumbbells and free weights and stuff. That's about all they really have in common, and that's something I don't think that most guys who lift really think about or digest properly. Is that if you're trying to train purely for hypertrophy, that training style is going to be more metabolically driven. Whereas if you're trying to train for powerlifting, it's really neurally driven. And if you're going to train like purely for strength, that's why I tell everybody, don't try to ride two horses with one ass. If you're going to try to maximize hypertrophy training, then train specifically for hypertrophy. And if you're going to train for pure maximal strength, then train for pure maximal strength training. So the training styles are very different. And what I had to learn how to do was my early training for bodybuilding was really based around the Dorian Yates, Mike Mincer type principles and modalities, and that was what I gravitated to because it made the most amount of sense to me. So it was there was a high emphasis on training to failure and progressive overload as the basis for what you did, and then making sure that you had the ability to recover properly from those training sessions in order to make progress. And to me, all of those things still apply to this day. The simplicity of it is, I think, often misapplied by a lot of people who aren't making progress, right? But going into powerlifting, I had to teach myself to not train to failure. I had to teach myself to just focus on basically the big three, squat, deadlift, bench press, and then, only use lifts that you're going to get carryover to because they were alike enough in their execution that you would get carryover. So over time, training got narrowed down, and I found this early on when I would look at how other guys train that were really strong. when it came to powerlifting, and they would focus just on the big three and just a few select movements outside of that to really help augment the progression of those things. So it's very different in that regard than training to develop muscle tissue, where you want to stress muscle tissue across different lengths of the muscle, while you're training and things like that. So it's just a very different mindset that you have to approach, and a very different modality that you have to apply into your training. So, and similarly, I probably found I couldn't train as often, even though that was the other part, is I learned that going heavy all the time is counterproductive to getting stronger as well. Since it's a neural adaptation that you're looking for, you're not training to failure. And the other thing is that you're probably doing, in my opinion, this is what I found that was most productive for me and then for the guys that I work with, was doing a little bit more volume on the competitive list because of the specificity, but then also moving the loads with the greatest amount of power and explosion during the concentric phases, because that's what activates the greatest amount of high threshold motor units. The thing is like, you don't really move into what I consider heavy loading, where you're pushing upwards of like 90% of your 1 rep max, except for maybe a week or two, maybe 2 weeks, right before a meet in your competition cycle. And a lot of guys that do powerlifting, they end up trying to emulate some of these guys I've seen on social media that train heavy all the time. And the thing that consistently, and I've had this talk, Eddie Conner, our good friends, and I had this talk with Eddie many times. The guys that are consistently training heavy, they don't last very long. They really don't. And I could start throwing out names, but it would seem like I'm throwing people under the bus. But if you look at the powerlifters of old time, and I'm talking about guys like Kurt Kowalski, and you look at Eddie, and you look at a lot of those guys, they didn't train heavy year round. They trained more. They had hypertrophy training cycles in the off season where they would try to grow and get bigger. Eddie grew into every weight class like over the years, right? And those guys, they didn't train ultra heavy year round. Andy Bolton and I had this conversation years ago. Andy used a very explosive training style and then only went heavy for short periods. And then the guys now, I think social media has changed some training thought processes and training principles and ideologies because of the fact that people want to grow their social media or be well known or whatever. And then they're training heavy all the time. Well, that takes a toll on the passive tissue, the connective tissue, those kind of things. And you're going to end up injured. And there's guys, that, over the years that were putting up big numbers, but now they don't compete anymore. They're always fucking injured. So if you approach a powerlifting or maximal strength training, like training cycles, and that's how you're going to approach it, it's like it's lifting heavy weights all the time, then you're not going to last very long.
Yeah. A lot of thoughts coming to mind, specifically in regards to the heavy training. Immediately thinking of the Russians and Boris Shaiko and his methodology, which people are generally familiar with. There's a variety of programs, and he individualizes each program. So
but if you look at the Shaiko cycles, I believe it was something, and I'd have to bring up the numbers, but right offhand, the majority of the training is done it's like 68 and 73% of your 1 rep max. So. And then you get these American guys that are always beat to shit, and I don't care if they're breaking world records. It's like one guy, right? Like it's like just a couple of guys that are doing with these. They don't adapt that methodology into their own training, so that way they have some longevity, and then peak going into a meet, and then back off, and then repeat those training cycles. And I learned how to do that. I actually wrote a manual called Base Building that was all centered around compensatory acceleration training, which I found to be super valuable, and just not getting into those super heavy weights all the time. And that was when I finally, when my deadlift broke the 700 barrier, and I squatted 660, and even my bench, I learned how to incorporate that more. But I didn't find that the compensatory acceleration worked quite as well with benching, but the point was I learned how to use submaximal loading in order to get stronger without beating myself up the whole time.
Yeah, awesome. In addition to that, I'm thinking about how the Russians in particular here, they like to take extended periods off. So they're not they're not pushing heavy weights all the time in training, and they're also just not pushing their training in general all the time, which can be pretty valuable. And people, I think most of us, we have a similar psychological disposition, and we don't like to put our foot on the brake, and we just like to keep pushing. But ultimately, our body will deload for us in some respects, right?
Yeah, I call that forced stress, right?
Yeah,
And you're right there, because like Milanichev will disappear sometimes for like months at a time, right? Like then he'll come back and be crushing everything more than he was before. People are like, how's he do that? I'm like, well, he lets his body recover and takes time off. But nobody, you're right, nobody wants to really do that.
for sure. You started out your response there by mentioning that when it comes to powerlifting and bodybuilding training, these are two distinct training systems, and I think that's super important because while this whole notion of power building or combining the two has died down over time, I would say like maybe 5 years ago, particularly in the natural bodybuilding realm, you saw everyone smashing barbell squats, bench, and deadlifts, not only just every week in their training, but multiple times per week. It was literally powerlifting, but these people were like, but I have a bodybuilding show coming up, but their training didn't really resemble that.
I think the dumbest little period that we went through there was the whole like squat 5 times a week and bench 3 times a week. And I remember this one guy, and man, I'm really having to reel it in because this topic used to make me so irritated. But the reason why was because there was no evidence to back any of this up, but yet all of them acted like they were working out of a scientific paradigm. That was the thing, and there was this one guy's like, oh, well, you can't. He's like, people say that you can't deadlift often a week. He's like, your body will adapt to it. I'm like, no, man. When there's muscle damage occurring and you have a suppressed nervous system, then yeah, there's no the adaptation can't occur until the recovery processes happen. So, and if that you can't just all of a sudden just recover. Like if you want, a lot of times strength isn't present because it's being suppressed by fatigue. And, my mentor, Charles Baldwin, when you say that, it was like, if you want strength to be expressed properly, you have to allow the recovery to take place. So the biggest factor in suppressing strength demonstration, actually being able to perform, is fatigue itself. And that's why you have a rest period. So there were so many over that. I really kind of forgot about that until you brought it up just now. Now I'm irritated all over again. There were so many dumbasses that came out during that time pushing people to like squat like almost every day. There's no benefit in it. And we actually know from the meta-analysis now, and we can get into that later, that when volume is equated for the training week, training a muscle group or a lift multiple times in a week doesn't really offer up any significant advantages. But that's still a battle that I have online because people have got it etched so deeply into their training methodology and the thinking about training is that training a muscle multiple times a week somehow offers up some advantage to training it once. But the only way that offers an advantage is just training time. So if you want to do 10 sets for chest in a week and you want to do 5 sets on Monday and 5 sets on Thursday, the only advantage is just breaking it up in that kind of way. But if you're doing the 10 sets on Monday, what we've seen, and this is through good studies done in the meta-analysis outcome is like, yeah, there's really just no benefit. Just whatever your volume training for the week is for a muscle group, however you want to split that up, if it's once every 7 days or if it's once every 4 days, whatever, as long as you can recover from it, there's no advantage to training that muscle group multiple times in a week.
You mentioned there 10 sets in particular. Would you say that in regards to this concept that seems to be rising, which is the ceiling for per session of effective volume, do you think that once we get past 10 sets in a session, maybe that work is a little bit less productive? Or would you think still, if you equate for volume, there's not much benefit to increasing frequency?
Well, I was just throwing out an arbitrary number. I know that was another question you wanted to get into was the volume debate, because I tend to be on one side of it compared to a lot of people in social media. But Chris Beardsley, who's probably the researcher I respect the most, or at least one of the most out of all the guys. I know Cass is a big fan of his too, and a lot of the guys, John Meadows and I, are both big fans of his. And I think that Chris does probably the best job of anybody of consistently relating the data that is being observed in peer-reviewed studies and then how it's applicable in real-world environments for training and stuff. And I think Chris does a really amazing job of that. And he just released a two-part article looking at basically what we now, and kind of hate this shit, but hold the minimum effective volume thing and the maximum effective. And basically how I try to think of what is most efficient, like how do we get the maximum amount of stimulation out of a training session so that we're just being efficient in our training. And I think Chris's article said that even for an advanced guy, I think it was literally 10 reps of what he calls effective reps. That so when you're training to failure in a training set, his hypothesis is that you're going to get maximally about 5 reps in that set, regardless of the rep range, that are going to contribute towards hypertrophy stimulus. So based on all the studies we've had done, he broke them all down and said that literally two sets to failure for a muscle is good enough for you and for an advanced guy to still get some hypertrophy stimulus. And that based on the current research that we have, it looks like 25 reps is about the right range to be at, which would be 5 sets to failure, which funny enough is about what, like, I remember me and Meadows having the conversation when we would break down our training and look at it. About 6 sets to failure is where we were falling pretty consistently for most muscle groups. And I know Jordan Peters also, like, that's about where he falls too. So I think as you get more advanced, if you're going to train in that type of fashion where you're going to have a high degree of effort and you're chasing either fatigue in a session or you're chasing progressive overload in a session, that you end up getting narrowed down. You can train really hard or you can train really long, but you really can't do both, especially once you start moving some legitimate poundage in your training. So right in there, I think for a muscle group in a training session, something to the tune of 5 or 6 sets is going to be about right. And here's my other thought process about this, is that if you can't grow from 5 or 6 sets, then you're probably not training as hard as you think you are. Because like Jordan, he talked about that. I had made a tweet a while back and I said, if you don't have a certain amount of anxiety going into your work sets, you really probably are not training hard enough. And I know that somebody had asked Jordan, like how he gets it done in 6 sets. He said, man, those 6 sets are like, those are anxiety-induced sets, all 6 sets, just like for legs, right? Like just 6 sets for legs. And he's like, those cause him a tremendous amount of anxiety in the training session. So there seems to be a pretty big disconnect, I think, between a lot of people who gravitate towards those, it's what I call muscle math. They think there's this mathematical equation for achieving hypertrophy, maximal hypertrophy, that if I do X number of sets for X number of reps at X loading with like an RPE of this and all this kind of stuff, then I'll achieve X, like that somehow it's algebra. It's like muscle algebra, and you put that figure together, and then you're going to get so many pounds of muscle out on the other side. I'm like, it really just doesn't work that way. So settling on something as simple as 5 or 6 really hard sets for a muscle in a training session, I think it's hard to go wrong with just being I think even that simplistic about it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I know the article you're talking about from Chris Beardsley. I read that recently, and I believe, I'm pretty sure the numbers you said were exactly what I saw as well. What was very interesting to me about that concept was that he mentioned in it when it comes to the number of hard sets per week, right? We tend to think of, 10 to 20 hard sets, like that's good. But what he mentioned was that in the context of, 5 hard sets per session, he said that your weekly volume for hard sets is probably reliant on the frequency. Mm-hmm. So there is no set number, but it's how frequently are you training and are you able to recover? So if you train twice per week and you can recover from 5 hard sets each session, there you go. If you're training 3 times per week, you can recover from 5 hard sets. Or if it's once, that kind of more or less determines here is around how many hard sets it should be per session. That's what you recover from. And that kind of determines your frequency and your weekly volume at the end of the day.
Yeah, and that's another simplistic term, right? Is that people say, when do you train a muscle again? When it's recovered. And then they go, when is that? I'm like, dude, I don't know. You have, those are things. The internet is so bad now. It's like people have become so lazy. Like, I'm like, you won't take 2 minutes to read a caption that I wrote that answers all the questions that you have. I deal with that on a daily basis. And like, I tell people it's in the caption. I've had people tell me I'm an asshole for saying it's in the caption, but I don't feel like I am. I feel like I'm, instead of enabling people to continue to be lazy, I'm like, go back. I spent 15 years plus before the internet came out, and all you could do, you had a magazine or you had a book and you could read, and you didn't get to ask anybody any fucking questions. So I'm like, if you can't take 2 minutes out to read a caption that answers your question, then you probably don't care as much as you think you do. Because everybody should want to increase the depth and the breadth of their knowledge about these things, because that helps to eliminate those internal questions that you may have. So taking the time out to read, I mean, we talked about an article, both of us reading, two separate articles from Beardsley, where he spent an enormous amount of time breaking down all, these multitude of studies. Then I'm super thankful that there's somebody out there that's willing to take that time out to do that. And I'm going to read his stuff rather than DM him and go, hey, Chris, what about blah, blah. I'm like, I'm just going to read the article. If there's something I don't understand, I'll read it again, because a lot of times you just go back and read it again. Oh, I got it. But people don't often want to take 2 minutes out to read a caption. And those kind of people, and some people, again, will say that I'm an asshole and I don't care. I think those people have trouble being helped. They just want somebody to give them a blanket answer. And I'm like, you guys have to read something, and research and studies and evidence-based is great, but you still, at the end of the day, have to go in, and those are just guidelines. They're guidelines that kind of point you in a general direction. And even Brad Schoenfeld talks about this. It's just guidelines. And then you have to actually go in and apply the principles to see what is going to work for you in what specific way. And that's how you come back to figuring out like what you can recover from, and also what it is that you enjoy doing. I think there's a big factor in the emotional state of training, in that if you don't really enjoy doing something, you're probably not going to do it very long or very productively.
For sure. And you mentioned Brad there, and when it comes to being evidence-based, and Brad literally being the leading publisher when it comes to muscle hypertrophy research, for someone like him to identify the value of practical experience and actually being in the trenches in order to figure out these nuances, like that's important, to all the PubMed warriors who would rather just
that just read the abstract.
That just read the abstract and they throw the link at you in response to your point. They don't explain why, this study supports anything. They just throw the link out there and like, we'll read this. It's troubling the lack of effort people want to put into this. They'll read the first line of your post, and that will maybe disagree with whatever thoughts they have in their head on what's going to follow. So they immediately ask a question. It's like, well, you're the real asshole because you didn't even read the post, and your answer is in there.
I got an email from a guy like a while back that this, and he basically tried to chew me out for the way that I responded. He didn't like those responses, and I don't care because I'm legitimately still trying to help people. I'm trying to say, hey man, like here's the caption. So go back and read it and take some time out to digest it. Think about this. If we send like everybody to school or to a trade school or whatever, what if our people who went through medical school adapted this same attitude and they were in class and they just didn't pay attention and they didn't read the books, and when it was time to take a test, they just started asking questions at that point? You wouldn't end up with people who had cultivated a very high degree of aptitude for learning or for applying. So I still feel like I'm helping people when I go, hey, read the caption, because then there's a certain degree, I feel like, then you have to apply some critical thinking. Because if you have a question, you go back and read the caption, you're like, oh, there it is. So I don't know how we got off on that tangent. That's definitely a pet peeve, daily pet peeve of mine.
Yeah, no, I understand. I think, just responding at all is nice enough of you, as someone who also like posts a lot on social media and tries to provide education more than anything. It takes some effort to put into these posts. Like, you're not just posting 2 sentences. You're literally running through the gambit in every post, putting in considerations and context. And, that should be more than sufficient. And then still having to deal with these comments that are ridiculous.
Yeah, but it's definitely a pet peeve when I know the answer is in the caption and they're still asking.
Kind of wrapping things back to the primary topic of discussion, you mentioned that, as we were discussing this concept of power building, that you're getting a little bit riled up there. Would you like to expand some further thoughts on this notion and just the effectiveness of this approach if it comes to someone who truly wants to prioritize muscle hypertrophy in their training and nothing else? How useful is power building?
I mean, I just don't think, I think once again, you're approaching something where you're going to get a little bit of both, right? Like you're going to build some maximal strength, and then you're going to build some muscle. But if you want to maximize your time in the gym, I think it's just like anything else. The way, I guess, that one of the best ways I could describe it, you take a sprinter. What if a guy said, I want to get better at my 100-meter dash time. But then he says, okay, but I also want to go get better at marathon running. It's similar, right? It's like, yeah. It's a similar analogy. It's like the guy that wants to, they're both running, but all of the physiological processes involved in getting both are quite different. So the guy that wants to get better at his 100-meter dash, while he's also trying to get better at when I say marathon running, maybe he can improve his 100-meter dash a little bit, but would he get way better if he just focused on improving his 100-meter dash? And would he get way better if he just focused on marathon running? Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And that's just kind of the mentality I think about those things. Like, if you want to grow, like, create a hypertrophy training cycle where you're like, okay, I'm just going to focus all my effort and energy on training to grow during these 12 weeks or 16 weeks or however long you want to do it. And then if you want to build maximal strength, focus on that. Because like I said, once I got into powerlifting and my idea was I need to develop maximal strength, there was so much I had to unlearn and then learn that was applicable to approaching training that way. So I think guys really help themselves by letting loose. But the biggest thing, I think that why some trainers struggle in that particular area is that they want to, I think a huge part is ego, to be honest. They want to be able to go in and lift X amount to show off at the gym and all that shit. And I've been there before. It's not like I'm not judging in a way like, oh, I didn't do that. Like, I did that too. I think we all go through phases where we want to do that. The cool thing now is I'm so far past that I get to enjoy training again because I don't really give a shit what I'm lifting. As long as I feel like my training is productive and it's producing the outcomes that I want, that's what I care about. And I think that's arriving at a place of training maturation where you can actually go in and what you're lifting is irrelevant as long as it's providing you what you need to create productive training sessions and productive outcomes so that your time spent in the gym is as highly productive as possible. And I think the reason why a lot of guys from a mental aspect, they want to lift. I worked with a local bodybuilder here for a few months, and he was doing the same thing, all the most ridiculously unproductive shit in his training because he couldn't put his ego aside and stop lifting the way that he was lifting. He was doing mile high squats and, doing like hack squats with knee wraps on and just all like, you know what I mean? And it was all ego based training. And he had incredibly, he had muscle groups that were just not developed at all, way underdeveloped compared to other parts of his body because of this ego training. And that comes back to kind of what we're talking about here. When you're training for hypertrophy, you are trying to pick movements that fit your structure and that train the tissue that you're trying to stimulate to grow very effectively. And a lot of the whole power building stuff, you're just moving weight from point A to point B, and there's no real thought process going into, okay, am I trying to stimulate some specific tissue here to grow when you're really not? And again, I think that you can mix those two thought processes together where I'm going to pick some select lifts that I just want to get stronger on, and then I'm going to do some work after. But I don't think you're maximizing either approach very effectively when you mix up those two modalities.
Excellent. And you mentioned there the entire general concept around hypertrophy training, and it's picking movements that fit you well, allow you to stimulate the targeted musculature appropriately. There's a good return on investment when it comes to the fatigue it generates, to the muscular stimulus. And I want to use that to kind of transition into our second half of the discussion, which is centered around exercise selection. I am curious what immediately comes to mind when I ask this question, and that is, what movements have you removed from your powerlifting training, and what movements did you not use ever in powerlifting training that have become your bread and butter as you focus more on hypertrophy?
Oh, I don't fucking deadlift anymore. I hate that fucking lift. I don't bench press. So I don't deadlift to bench press. I squat, but my squatting's totally different. And I'll squat for a cycle here or there, but if I get sick of squatting, I'll just drop it in and I don't feel guilt about it, which is great. So I got rid of deadlifts completely. Got rid of benching. I tore my pec after I retired from powerlifting, which is the most messed up thing of all time. I tore my pec doing dips of all things. And but I wouldn't be bench pressing anyway. Because like I said, I train for hypertrophy work now, so I wouldn't be bench pressing regardless. So I don't deadlift anymore as far as like conventional deadlifts. I don't do conventional deadlifts, and I don't bench press. I got rid of those. I don't do much overhead pressing. That was one of my bread and butters during my powerlifting years. I was a really, really strong overhead presser. Probably the only guy I could think of that I see in powerlifting even more that was stronger than me in overhead pressing probably is Larry Wills. I was kind of exceptional in overhead pressing. I was right on top of a 405 press behind the neck by the time I retired. I did 385. I did 365 for a double. So there's really nobody in powerlifting that could hang with me in terms of overhead pressing stuff, which unfortunate we didn't do an overhead press powerlifting competition, but I was pretty much stronger than almost everybody in that area. But I don't even do that anymore for the most part. Every once in a while I will. Which goes to tell you, I dropped my ego altogether once I left because that was my strongest lift. Let's see. I don't really do one of my bread and butters when I was powerlifting was deficit stiff leg deadlifts to help build my deadlift, and I got a lot of carryover. If my deficit stiff leg deadlift was going up and my squat was going up, one of the things that I figured out I could do there with my deadlifts, I didn't have to train it super heavy. I could just train the motor pattern. And then as meet time got closer, I would just increase the loading of the deadlift, and it worked beautifully. And then I actually ended up pulling 725 from a deficit and training that way. So that was something that I learned. And then the other stuff, by the time that I was getting ready to not powerlift anymore, the lifts that I used it was squat, bench, deadlift. I would front squat, which I don't front squat anymore. And I think from a hypertrophy standpoint, front squats are borderline, not worthless, but they're very suboptimal. And that's another thing that blows a lot of people's minds. But you'll get into that. And I know that you've done enough stuff where you looked at the N1 guys. You understand the need for bracing and stability and all that kind of stuff too. And a lot of people don't understand those concepts. But I don't front squat anymore. And that was a lift that I used often in power. And I think the front squat's a good lift if you're a strength-based athlete. That the front squat's a great lift. But I don't use it because I'm not a strength-based athlete anymore. So I never really liked sumo deadlifting. So I never did that. But for the most part, I was so bare bones by the end. My training just looks so totally different now. I use a multitude of different lifts now because I really, more than ever before, and all the years before, I understand the need for targeting certain divisions of a muscle and the tissue and those kind of things. And it's a little more, and I hate to say this, it's a little more complicated, I think, than a lot of people understand. And I've spent the past few years really, like I said, really working with the guys out of N1, but really learning how to target certain areas of a muscle. And for a long time, people would call that bro size, but we know it's not fucking bro size anymore. It's actually completely legitimate. There's research to back that up. Even understanding that there's different areas of the hamstrings that get hit in relation to, say, a leg curl to a Romanian deadlift, right? So right now, I would have to say, I don't know. I think I just love training overall. I don't know that there's lists now. I think I just do so many different exercises in training now for the purpose of targeting either certain tissue or certain divisions of a muscle or whatever. I just love training overall so much more now. I think the variety is a huge part of that anymore. Just being able to do so many different things.
I think when it comes to the key principles of training, you mesh these concepts so beautifully well. And by that, I mean, you post a lot about, how important it is to train with a high level of effort and the importance of execution as like these staple blocks. But then also at the same time, you're promoting these nuances of exercise selection and making sure that the movement you choose targets what you want to target. I feel like I saw a post, I don't know, probably a couple of months ago from you and talking about exercise selection and how important it is. And I think you mentioned something in terms of like people who want to be a troglodyte about their exercise selection and not think about it. And I just lost it when I read that. I thought it was hilarious. Moving into some of the specific lifts you mentioned there, the deadlift, for example, when I was powerlifting, deadlift was my best lift. I was a mediocre powerlifter, but by far that was my best lift. And since then, it's probably been about a year and a half. I haven't pulled from the floor, and I only utilize stiff leg Romanian variants just because of the benefits for muscle hypertrophy. And also conventional deadlifts from the floor just like wrecked me. Like basically the
funny thing is when you get rid of conventional deadlifts, you realize how much better you feel overall. And I think a lot of people understand just how wrecked that you stay from doing conventional deadlifts. And then when you get rid of them, like training just feels so much better top to bottom. But I can do Romanians. I feel like that I am absolutely targeting my glutes and my hamstrings super effectively. I don't feel anywhere near as beat up. I don't get the workout hangover. There's just something about I don't know, because you would think with a Romanian you would get that same problem, but I don't. And from the guys that I've trained, that I've worked with, other guys that kind of give their own testimonial, they say the same thing. It's just not the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you kind of expand there why a Romanian variation would be superior to a deadlift from the floor? And then also, I've seen that you're a pretty big fan of the trap bar for deadlifts, so maybe touch on that as well and the benefits there.
Well, if when you're using a Romanian, you're going to get a more lengthened hamstring and a little bit more lengthened glute as well. Because with the deadlift, you're going to have a little bit more knee flexion, and what happens is that you end up losing that length in the hamstring. So as you squat, it's kind of like when you squat down. Like the hamstrings don't really lengthen very much in the squat. They don't really do a whole lot in the squat. Actually, they help to stabilize the knee a little bit, but if you're looking at a regular deadlift, because you have hip flexion and knee flexion at the same time, the length of the hamstring almost stays relatively the same. Whereas when you're using a Romanian, you're hinging way harder, and then the hamstrings will get to that maximum lengthened position pretty fast if you do it right. So there's a lot of tension that's happening, and then a muscle, of course, that's being placed under resistance while it's being lengthened has a higher degree of force production than a muscle that's not. So when you think about, even from that application, that in a regular deadlift, a conventional deadlift, the hamstrings still have to do some work, but there's not as much tension that's being placed on them as you're going to get out of a Romanian. So from a hypertrophy standpoint, the Romanian is just such a better option to choose to train the hamstrings and to train the glutes than you're going to get out of a deadlift. And then, of course, like we just talked about, anecdotally, what I found is that you don't get the same amount of fatigue debt systemically that you get from a conventional type deadlift. So the benefits are much greater. I think the Romanian is one of the best, if not, if you had to say what's your best posterior chain movement for hypertrophy, probably the Romanian deadlift is going to be where I'm going to go. And then I think you can also use the trap bar. And I think the reason why I like the trap bar is because with your hands out to your side like that, most people are just going to find that it's going to fit their structure a lot better to move, and that there's a little bit less going on there in terms of loading the erectors in the low back. And I think there could be a part in that where when your erectors, when you have a significant amount of, say, muscle damage or fatigue that happens in the erectors, there may be something that goes on from a nervous system standpoint, and which is why maybe a conventional deadlift does that more as far as taxation. But a trap bar, I have found I can really let, and other people that I've worked with found the same thing. The versatility of the trap bar, number one, is such a big bonus because you can make a really good quad based movement if you go with the hill elevated version, or you can really load the glutes and hams, especially the glutes in that lengthened position. And that's what I use it for predominantly. And I just think the versatility of it, plus the positioning of it with the load in relation to the position you get in with your body, is less taxing on the erectors in the low back. And so it's less of a low back loaded movement and more of like that lengthened glute type movement, or you can use it for, like I said, the quads. So I just think those are the two. If you're going to do a deadlift, those are two better variations or options to use than conventional deadlifts, and especially like sumo deadlifts.
Yeah, awesome. Related to the comments on the trap bar, I found similar things with using dumbbells, a dumbbell RDL, usually
Yep.
fitting people a little bit better since they can put that load where they want it.
Yep.
That seems to be a really good option too. And diving into squat patterns, you touched on how a front squat might be suboptimal. Front squats have never been part of my training. I rarely program them, especially for bodybuilding, even powerlifters in most cases. As you mentioned, I think that there are some limitations in your ability to produce force. You see, upper back position breaking down before quads are even like relatively stimulated. Then there's just
because the loading of the front squat is highly dependent on your ability to stabilize the load in that really shitty position, right? So, I mean, it's true. So, like you have it's like a high degree of internal stability is required to stabilize in that position, right? I mean, you think about it, you have this back on you that you can just put a bar on and there's like instant stability, or like there's way more stability, but no, I got an idea. Let me take it, put it in the front where I have a low degree of stability. And then I'm going to try to tax my legs. It's like Zerchers are the most worthless piece of shit. Zercher anything is the biggest piece of shit in the history of piece of shit exercises, right? Like you said, I remember it was Jim Windler that told me, we were laughing because he hated Zerchers too. And he's like, I don't do Zerchers because I'm not in prison. So I thought I thought that was the best way you could describe how worthless a fucking Zercher anything is. And the if you're a strength athlete, like I said, for a strong man, because they have to deal with it, was it a Conan's wheel or axle, like anything there's that one they do where it's like loaded in the crux of their arms. So like a Zercher could be good for guys wanting to train that particular position, right? But anybody else, I see people doing Zerchers. I'm like, dude, why? There's no Zercher lift done in powerlifting. Like I said, in strongman, it's the only one where they sometimes have to do it. But for bodybuilding, there's 100% no reason to ever do a Zercher anything. For physique development, there's 100% no reason to do Zercher anything. Nothing.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. I think some people, they might find that a front squat, similar to just a goblet squat, feels a little more comfortable in terms of getting into the hole and being able to keep things a little more stacked. But I think perhaps a better solution, if you have access there, is just to use a safety squat bar.
Yeah, just use a safety squat bar. And that's something that comes up on the yoke squat. Somebody asked this past week, will front squats be an adequate substitute? And they asked why I didn't program front squats or use them. And number one was the lack of stability, or the increased need of stability. So some people don't understand the concept that the more stability we have, whether it's provided by external stability, and if somebody doesn't understand this concept, I guess we'll back up and explain this. So in like a hack squat, you have a lot of external stability because you have a back pad, you have the pads on your shoulders. You already have the exercise itself, the apparatus is providing you stability, external stability. So now you just focus on producing force by the muscle, right? So then the less stability we have, the less stable that the joint's going to be. We can only stabilize as much as we can create stability, internally through our internal bracing. So in a front squat, it requires probably the greatest amount of internal bracing. So you can only create, like I said, you can only create enough stability by how hard the muscles can produce like tension around the joints. So a front squat is going to allow the least amount of stability. And so now the muscles are going to they'll be able to produce the least amount of force. They're going to say, hey, look, I don't have super stable joints to work around. So I'm going to make sure you stay safe. And I'm only going to produce as much force as you can stabilize that joint. And that's for every exercise you do. The other part is that for a lot of people, and they don't realize this, if they'll look at their squat, put a bar on their back and look at their squat and look at the lever arm or the movement arm in relation to that, a lot of times the front squat's not giving them anything that the back squat isn't already giving them in terms of lever arm. So why would you? So now if that's the case, you just decrease the amount of stability. So you decrease the amount of output that the muscle can produce. So you had a really shitty exercise where you could just put a barbell on your back or a safety bar and you're going to get a much better exercise. So there's so many variables with why front squats are just not great that it's just best not to even include them.
Cool. Great context there, Paul. I think most people would consider this podcast to be primarily bodybuilding based. And with that in mind, shows are one from the back, right? So let's talk a little bit about back training here. And in recent times, I feel like there's a bit of a divide. I don't know. I'm probably playing this out more than it needs to be. There's a bit of a divide in how we should be utilizing the barbell row. So you'll see a lot of people with the barbell row, explaining, hey, torso should more or less be parallel to the ground. We're dead stop on each rep, prevent any momentum whatsoever. And then you see these other people who are saying, that's not the purpose of a barbell row. Our purpose here is to load it up to get a good stimulus. And I think, perhaps a little bit of momentum isn't a bad thing, but then there are people who take it another step and it just looks like some sort of weird shrug. And I'm not sure how productive that really is. When we're talking about the barbell row, why are we using this exercise? What part of the back are we primarily targeting? And for that reason, what would more or less be the best position to get in to make sure those muscles are being targeted?
So with a barbell row, much like a T-bar row, anything where we're back to the stability issue, right? So that's going to be the overall limiting factor. And there's a multitude of issues that can occur with people when they don't check their ego in order to do an integrated style movement like this. So it's integrated because we're asking basically the muscles of the, believe it or not, the glutes and the hams to help stabilize too, right? Because that's what's stabilizing off the floor. And then more or less what we'd want is we'd want a fixed position by the torso, because otherwise what happens is, and what you were talking about there, where you'd see people turn into this moment, it's like a momentum based lift where they're lifting off the floor. And there's one person in particular I could throw under the bus for this, but I won't. That does the shittiest rows that I see. It's basically like a hybrid shrug bro lift, and it's because he won't back off the loading. So, do you know who I'm talking about?
I feel like I have multiple names that come to
Yeah,
mind.
there's probably okay. So most guys really fucking do this. Okay, so to me, in a good barbell row, you can get into a fixed torso position and drive the elbows back to shorten the muscles up there. You're training scapular retraction, more or less, right? That's what you're training. And so you're going to be training the mid back. You're going to be training the traps, a little bit of the rhomboids, of course. So what you're training is retraction. And so, well, with the other area that we have to come back here, which is a good one to address, is what are we initiating with in a movement? And that's a huge part of making an exercise productive too, because whatever it is that we're initiating with is what is going to hog up a lot of the tension in that movement. So if you're one of those guys that likes to pile a fuck ton of weight onto your barbell row and you like to jerk it like that, what you're seeing here is, like, if this is your torso, if your head's up here and you see these guys doing this motion here, you're training the low back, okay? Because that's what's initiating that momentum. And then they get a little bit of elbow drive that comes back. But if they backed way off the loading, they would actually, you remember, like, what would they be initiating with at that point? Would be the muscles that are attached to the scapula, right? So they would have a higher degree of force production that's happening on the mid traps, on the rhomboids, despite the fact that the loading's less, but the amount of intramuscular force that's being produced will be much higher because those muscles are having to initiate the movement of that load. But when you take and pile on a shit ton of weight, and then you have to do this jerking motion like right here, what's doing that motion is you're just lifting it with your erectors over and over again, right? So if you literally backed off and you could stay in this position and you had, I know I'm doing all sorts of hand puppets today, but that's fine. And then you had the elbow drive coming straight back right here. But what these guys do is they raise up, and then there's very little in terms of retraction going on. Whereas if they just backed off loading and stayed in a fixed position and had good elbow drive behind their body, they would get the muscles much more shortened and create a higher degree of intramuscular force during those sets.
Excellent. I know some people might be listening to this and they can't see the hand motion, but your hand motion, I'm not good with. I don't know what the degree is here. It's between parallel to the floor and completely upright, whatever angle that is.
So here's my own thinking about that is that I think there's a degree in there. Dorian used to like 70 degrees when he would do the underhand. He felt like he had less pressure on his low back and that he could actually get a much stronger contraction in his back by using a more like a 70-degree angle, which is pretty. It's not quite like upright, but it's definitely not bent over parallel with the floor. If you're going to be parallel bent over with the floor, my advice there is to use a dead stop row, because otherwise, if you're bent over at the floor, you need to use smaller plates so that it's not touching the floor. But the other thing is I feel like in that particular position, man, the erectors are having to do a lot of work to hold you in that position statically against that load. So when you rise up a little bit, then you end up with a little bit more of a mechanical position where you have a little bit more of a mechanical advantage over the loading. And then the lower back is not taking as much of a brunt of the loading. The only downside to that is that the higher that you get, the less scapular retraction that you're going to get. So the less shortening of those muscles. So it comes back to finding that kind of that area in there that I think it's a little less, maybe it's like 60 degrees or maybe it's like 55 degrees or something like that. But it's not, I don't feel like it's parallel with the floor. I know what it is when I'm in it. And the only way I can say, one of the things I found is when the bar is right below my knees, I'm in the right position. If the bar is above your knees at the bottom, you're probably too high. And then if the bar is like at mid shin, you may be a little too low. That's just kind of an overall, everybody's got to experiment with their own gray area. But that for me, when the bar is like literally right at my patella, I feel like I'm in the right position.
I think that's extremely useful, and the listeners are going to get a ton out of that. We stated here that when you're using the barbell row, the muscles that you're going to target, kind of the middle of the back. We're looking at traps. We're looking at rhomboids. But you didn't really mention the lats there getting a significant stimulus. So when we're trying to target the lats specifically, what movement should we be prioritizing? What are we looking at here?
That's a really good question. I like the way you phrase that because that's another one that I get in my yoke squad group is when people, they don't have access to a particular piece of machine, they'll say, well, is this a good substitute? And I'm like, you guys, I love you, but you're missing the point. So it's not about really substituting particular movements. It's about the execution of how you're performing them. So when it comes to lat training, it's really just all about the same execution that you're going to perform over and over and over again. And it's really going to matter whether you're doing a movement where you're stressing the iliac fibers, which is the lower lat fibers, where you're coming from really high, like a pull down, or whether you're doing stressing more of the thoracic fibers where you're coming from like a row. But regardless of which one you're doing, if you're lat training, it's just going to be the same principles over and over again. Don't arch your low back or don't arch at the thoracic because then you're going to disadvantage the lat. You're going to make it more of a scapula-based movement, right? And so you want to brace with your abs. You want to drive your elbow down towards your hip, and you don't want to pull your arm past your body. It's like that's the three things I just tell people over and over again to break it down real easy. Brace with your abs, drive your elbow down, don't pull past the body because the lats don't pull the arm past anatomical position. And the funny thing about this is when you give people this, they have heard so much bullshit for so long that it's like they can't get their head around it. They're like, how do the lats not pull the arm past the body? I'm like, well, if you understand their origin and insertion, you would understand why they don't pull the arm past the body. They can't. It's literally impossible. But they will argue with you on this. They're like, well, somebody told me that. I'm like, it doesn't matter. You can only get a muscle shortened from origin to insertion. That's everything that we do in trying to get a muscle shortened, right? So we're trying to pull the origin and insertion closer together. So in a lat-based movement, you can't pull the arm past the body because once you get to that anatomical position and you want more, transverse shoulder extension or some type of shoulder extension, then something else has to do that.
Perfect. I think for a lot of people, we get into fitness. It becomes a big part of our lifestyle, but we might not have ever been formally educated. And for that reason, we kind of skip over those basic courses in science, anatomy and physiology, exercise phys, where we go over these concepts of, origins and insertions and what we're really trying to do and where joints need to be moving in order to target certain muscles.
Right, exactly. But the biggest thing is that so many people, they understand, say, certain component functions of a muscle, but then think that component function, if it's trained or if you want to train that muscle, that's the component function that you have to do. For example, this is the big one comes up is shoulder adduction, right? Like in lat stuff. But when you think of like real adduction, it's coming down like this. The lats don't have any advantage in this position. So the body naturally is always going to say what muscle has the greatest amount of mechanical advantage in a particular position. And it's going to be efficient because it'll use those muscles. So when you talk about, shoulder adduction, or you talk about humerus adduction like that, that's literally this right here is what that is. Right? The lats don't have the advantage. They can say, let me stabilize the humerus. So the muscles that are attached, like originate on the scapula, then attached to the humerus, basically the teres major, right? Can pull that down. So when you're looking at like a pull down, people are like, well, pull downs or chins or lats. I'm like, well, yes, the lats do get some stimulation from stabilizing the humerus in that position, but the body's going to say, what's the most efficient to mechanically load this position in? It's going to be the muscles of the upper back. A lot of times it's going to be the teres major. And people say stuff like, well, they're not big enough. The lats aren't as big as people think either, right? Like it's a combination of all this stuff working together. Like I think it was another graph that Beardsley produced a while back. It's like, what is it? The triceps and the deltoids are actually the two biggest muscles from if you actually like look at a muscle under imaging, the biggest muscles in the torso are actually the triceps and deltoids. So, and the lats are actually down below a couple of other things. So it's like thinking about your just your lats alone, pulling your whole body up doesn't make a lot of fucking sense either. So yeah, it's the amount of shit that you have to deal with online is crazy, right?
So much valuable insight here, Paul. I know I'm really enjoying it. The listeners are going to as well. Before we wrap things up, were there any other keys you wanted to drop in terms of exercise selection? Anything that really gets you going and you want to expand on real quick? Any other muscles or
I think
movements?
the big one that we're still fighting pretty often when we have to. There's a couple of dead horses that we continue. There's a couple of dead horses that we continuously have to beat. Number one is deadlifts aren't a back exercise, and I'll argue that with people. It's not that the back doesn't have end course. Like when you the muscles of the back, and I just posted about this, that muscles of the back perform an isometric contraction to stabilize the spine and the position of the external load in relation to the body. But what's actually moving the load are the muscles that are responsible for hip extension. As far as I know, there's no muscles of the upper back that contribute to hip extension. So, and some people go, why is it important? And I say it's important from a programming perspective, right? It really is, because if you want to maximize your programming and you want to be able to recover fully, you do need to understand what it is you're taxing the most severely with a particular movement. And in a movement that's as big as the deadlift, which again, we come back to what we said earlier, there's better options. But if you're going to deadlift, and it's pretty a shitty lift to use from a hypertrophy standpoint, when there's, like we said, much better options. It's pretty down the list. But if you just have to use it because you're one of those guys, then put it on a lower body day. So the other one is the scapula stuff. That one comes up a lot. That one still it's hard for me to believe the amount of misinformation, bad information that we have. When for a while now, there's a lot of coaches now that understand the concept of, hey, you don't want to hold scapular retraction. There's so many people I talk to daily or get DMs from that when they either start following me or have been for a while, and they start allowing that scapular humerus relationship to function normally in their training, that their shoulder problems just go away in a matter of weeks. They're like, holy shit, my shoulder doesn't hurt anymore. So the coaches that are still teaching that, Cass likes to use a pretty strong expression that's borderline malpractice, because they really are fucking their shoulders up. And it really sucks for those people. But you still have a lot of dumb meathead mostly powerlifting coaches that are still teaching that hold and scapular retraction. It destabilizes the joint. The whole myth that it stabilizes the shoulder more is true. The acromion space in there actually gets smaller when you hold in retraction and then try to press. I don't know why people couldn't. You could see if you had like a skeleton here, it could show that. But allowing some depression, I think it's the guys out of Kabuki teach this, and they teach that you want to get into depression, but from a scapular depression to stabilize the shoulder girdle, you still allow a certain amount of protraction, and you still allow a certain amount of the scapula to rotate around the rib cage when you go into the concentric. And that's a much more safer for powerlifters, a way to actually create stabilization in the shoulder rather than destabilizing by holding. But you have to allow that. And then Cass did the latest one, the EMG stuff that he's done, that actually shows like the pec, really the amount of activation it does when you're holding your retraction is like nothing, right? So then you have to have the triceps and the deltoids have to create more activation than they should have to, but you're not allowing the anterior serratus to do its job. There's just so much dysfunction that goes on when you do that, right? Like, it's crazy. And the other part that's crazy is, like, can you think of any other like sport or human body movement you do where you hold your shoulders back behind you and then throw your arm around? Like, imagine a pitcher, like a Major League Baseball pitcher, going into like scapular retraction and holding it and then trying to throw a ball, like, right? Like, the body doesn't function that way. And it's crazy that over the years that people actually came up with that. And there's still a multitude of powerlifting coaches, I think, that teach that shit. Like, I think Matt Winning's one of them. And there's and they don't, I don't know if and here's the thing. I taught that stuff at one time too, but as I started to learn more and more and more about proper mechanics and biomechanics, the way that the body really needs to function under load, the more you realize it's really natural movements. What you're teaching, you're actually having to undo a lot of shitty motor patterns that people have learned and actually just teach them how to move naturally. So a lot of what you end up learning is just how to create the greatest amount of stability, and then just you allow your body to move naturally. And if you get set up properly to movement from the start, you actually, if you just let your body move naturally, that's more times than not is going to be your proper biomechanics.
Yeah, I can confirm specifically with that benching example. While I was powerlifting, I was pretty darn bad at the bench press, so I did a lot of bench pressing, and I also, was in hard retraction, and my pecs did not get in centimeter bigger throughout that process.
They won't. People say like that was one of the myths why for years and years people say, well, the bench press isn't a good pec exercise. Well, it's definitely not a good pec exercise if you actually your nervous system is telling your pecs don't do anything. I don't want you to work. I'm gonna ask everything else to do work but you. So then people are like, well, the bench press doesn't develop the pecs. It's really crazy because in the 70s, everybody had crazy pec development. Go back and look at the 70s. Arnold, Franco, Sergio, Serge Dubray, all of those guys had crazy pec development. And they all bench pressed a lot, but none of them did that scapular retraction bullshit. Like, it's crazy, right? Like how that works.
Yeah, that's a super interesting example. And on the topic of what the scapular are doing in movements, similarly to the bench press, initiating a pull down with scapular retraction.
I see that one too. And like a lot of people don't understand, you're creating dysfunctional motor patterns that way because the body's not. Why would you, if you were hanging off a cliff and you need to pull yourself up, would you just pull yourself up or would you go into scapular retraction and depression first? No, you would just pull yourself up. Right?
I think that's a very good way to put it. We're coming up on our hour here. Paul, I wanted to thank you so much for your time. That's all of the questions I have for you today. I really appreciate it. For the listeners who aren't already following and supporting you, where should they go to learn more about you?
I think now at the point, I'm so infamous that if you just search, so if you just type in Paul Carter, I think I'm the first one that comes up. So
I would say so.
Yeah. I think that I am. Like, not to be arrogant, but I believe I'm the first one that comes up now. But otherwise, you can Google lift, run, bang, and for the most part, all of my training stuff related to training, nutrition, eating, that stuff is on my Instagram now.
And that will be in the show notes. Everyone, that does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Hey guys, Mike here. If you're interested in learning more about how to maximize your health, body composition, and performance, head over to hammerawayfitness.com where you can sign up for coaching or even just schedule an hour consult with me to get some of your training and nutrition questions answered. Also, if you enjoyed this episode as much as I did and would like to further support the growth of the Muscle Memoirs podcast, you can give a donation to the link in the show notes, leave us a review, and or share this episode with your friends, whether that be dropping the link in a group chat or putting a screenshot in your Instagram story. I truly appreciate it.